Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome back to another session. Today we're going to look at the rulings pertaining to the prayer of travel. Now, travel is generally considered a hardship because in a traditional society, traveling wasn't easy. It was something that needed to be planned days or weeks or even months ahead. Modes of transport were either camels, horses, donkeys, and the like, or walking even. And distances were great. Water holes in between were difficult, so people had to travel with their water, and they'd have to work out how long it would take to get from one place to another place in order to refresh their camels or themselves. So as a result, it's considered a form of hardship, and it's a form of suffering as well, where your sins are forgiven as well. Your sins are forgiven through the sufferings of hardship that you go through. And as such, there are some rulings that are attached to this. One of them is that the dua of the traveler is accepted. So that's why people traditionally ask people who are going to travel that please pray for us on the way, because they are under the mercy of Allah. They've been tested, they've been forgiven, and their du'as are answered. They're also eligible for zakat, because even if they're wealthy, they could have lost everything. They could be in an area where they don't have access to their own money, so they are also eligible to take something from your zakat as well. Okay, so now we're going to have a look at some of the special rulings concerned with being a traveler. So we'll start with what the author says. The author says, the least distance of travel in which it is valid to shorten the prayer is that of 3 days on a camel, which is roughly around 50 miles. The traditional mode of transport back then was, as mentioned, walking or a camel. So the distance that a human can cover in the desert in 3 days would be about 50 miles. 48, 50 miles, it's an estimate. And they would travel from sunrise all the way to noon, and then they'd rest for the remainder of the day. And if they wanted to, they'd travel again for an hour towards in the evening. Or they generally wouldn't travel because it's very hazardous to travel at night time. They can't see anything. Second thing is even if it's a full moon night and they can see where they're going, there's things like snakes and scorpions and other things in the desert, camel spiders and other things that make it difficult for them to pass on certain terrain. And secondly is that, remember, their clothing, they would be wearing sandals, some of them would be barefooted, and having very thin clothing. Not everybody could afford travel clothes. So as such, traveling over any terrain that you can't see is very dangerous, because a slight cut or an infection can leave you open to sepsis, blood poisoning and death, because they didn't have access to medication as we have today. So nobody would take unnecessary risks. So here we're talking about roughly 50 miles, which is a 3 days journey, and that holds true for today. We don't look at distance traveled, we don't look at time, we look at distance. So even if a fast horse can traverse those 50 miles in 2 days as opposed to 3 days, we still look at it as the distance, and by extension today we'd look at it as travel through a car. So in an hour you traverse that distance, or an hour and a half, but we still look at it as the distance. So what are the rulings pertaining to once you've traveled those 50 miles? Number one, it's an estimation of the distance. So that means that nobody's asking you to the speedometer or the pedometer or whatever you've got, it has to be on the dot 50 miles. When these calculations were formulated, nobody had access to rulers or any of these things. It was an estimate, and that still holds true today. So it's between 48 and 50 miles. It's an average. So when you know that you've done around 50 miles, then that's where your time kicks in. Nobody's asking you to be OCD about it and get a ruler out and start working out what 50 miles is. Hence, when a person has left his place of residence having passed city limits, intending to travel to a place that is at least a 3 days journey away at a medium pace, then he has the choice to not fast in Ramadan. So basically what the author is saying here is there are a number of dispensations that start once you are considered a traveler. One of them is Ramadan, and there's a whole list of them we're going to go through. So first of all, we need to understand the author says intending travel. What does he mean by intending travel? If I'm traveling and I'm traveling 20 miles down the road, and then I know I'm going to stay there and I'm going to come back, that's not considered an intended travel for the intending of 50 miles. I need to know in my mind I'm going to travel 50 miles before I travel. So if I travel one day 20 miles and then come back, or if I travel to another place without the intention of travel, I know it's close to my house and I come back, this is not the travel that we're considering, right? I need to make an intention. I need to know before I've left for my journey that I'm traveling, say for example, from London to Manchester. Manchester's probably around 180 miles away. So that's more than the 50. So now this is an intended travel. So what this means now is, now that I've intended the travel, the minute I leave my city limits, all of the dispensations, the rukhsas now kick in immediately, and I have those dispensations at my disposal. So the one about fasting is that if, for example, I'm a traveler, one of the dispensations is that I don't have to fast. So in this instance, if I'm on a journey, I've left my city limits, everything, and I left before dawn, so before the time for fasting came in. I'm outside of London now. I'm on the M1 heading north, and then dawn strikes. Now I've left my city limits, right? So now I have the option of not fasting or fasting. It's preferable to fast, but I have the option of not fasting. Had I been in London when dawn kicked in, then I would have to fast regardless of the fact if I was traveling in an hour's time, if it was a 3-day journey or a 200-mile journey, and the rest of the dispensations would kick in, but this dispensation would not start until obviously the next day if I'm still at the location I intend to be at. Also, traveling where there is a leader amongst the group, for example, such as an army family travel. So the army behind a general will not necessarily know where the intended location is and how long it will take to get there. The general knows this, and the elite of around the general, they know this. So in this instance, it's the general's intention that counts, because the general obviously knows that we're going from A to B, and it's going to be over 50 miles. We're going to be there for so and so days, and the general rank and file don't know this. So he has the intention, and that intention suffices for everybody else. Likewise, a father, for example, he's got a family, he's taking them somewhere, and for some reason he doesn't want to tell them where he's going, or it's a surprise for them, and he's taking them on a day trip to France or up north somewhere to a sightseeing place and everything. He knows it's past 50 miles, so the dispensations would start based on the intention of what the father knows, the leader of the group. So now we're going to have a look at most of the dispensations here. So first of all, it's mandatory to shorten the prayer, right? So the shortening of the prayer is something that is wajib when you travel. Everything else is a dispensation, a rukhsa, which means you have the leeway to do it or not to do it. The lawgiver has given us a dispensation in this, is he's given us something to make our life easy on the journey, and we have the option of doing it and not doing it. It's always preferable to do it, right? If you don't do it, there's no worldly consequence on you, and some of the acts you make up, so for example like a missed fast or something like this. But when it comes to the shortening of the prayer, it's no longer a dispensation, it's actually wajib, so you have to do it. Now, one of the reasons for that is that your Lord wants this for you, right? It's not a case of, okay, if you can pray, then pray the 4, if you can't pray, pray the 2, right? No, it's a case of your Lord wants this ease for you, and He's made it wajib, necessary upon you, mandatory upon you, so something that you have to do. Because the original prayer, this is before Rasulullah ﷺ was given the 5 daily prayers. Rasulullah ﷺ and the companions would pray 2 cycles in the morning and 2 cycles in the evening, and that was the original prayer. Basically is the 2 cycles, right? And the prayer that was given later built on that. So when we have 4 cycles now, the original core of it remains the 2, and then it's the additional 2 that's built around it, right? So it's just reverted back to its original form, and it's become mandatory for you to perform 2 cycles as opposed to 4 cycles. The option of not fasting it outside the city limits, we mentioned this in the beginning. So if you're outside the city limits, once you're firmly outside the city limits and the time starts, then you have the dispensation of fasting or not fasting. If you're in the city limits and you've planned out your journey, right, and the time kicks in, the Fajr starts, then you have to fast. It's compulsory upon you. For example, wiping over the footgear. Now, wiping over the footgear, we mentioned in a previous lesson, right, it extends to 3 days if you're on a journey. So the minute you're outside of city limits now, that extends to 3 days, right? Taking into account how many hours you had your kuffs on before you set off on your journey. Also, it's not mandatory anymore to attend the Friday prayer, and it's not mandatory either to perform the Eid Salah or to perform the Zibaha, the Udhiyah, the sacrifice for Eid al-Adha. It's no longer mandatory upon you. You can do any of these things if you want, but it's no longer mandatory upon you if you're on a journey. Forbidden for a woman to travel beyond this point without a mahram. So a woman within the 50 miles is free to travel without a companion that's of her unmarriageable kin, like her brother, father, grandfather, nephew, and son. And there's a few others. But when it comes to going past this journey, then she needs to have someone who travels with her from the beginning up to her final destination. In addition, our author says, he must shorten the 4-unit fard prayers to 2 units, as we mentioned, i.e. he is not allowed to pray them as 4. Now there's a condition, there's something that needs to be understood here. If he does pray the prayers as 4 units, then it is invalid unless he sat the first sitting between units 2 and 3, in which case the prayer is valid, although he has committed a serious error, i.e. it is prohibitively disliked if done purposely, or necessitates a sajda sahu if done by out of forgetfulness. Now, why would that be? It seems very strange. So in the first instance, our author says your prayer is invalidated unless you have done the following. Now, what's the following? So I have to pray 2 cycles now. By default, I'm a traveler. I have to pray 2 cycles. If I prayed 4 cycles, right, my prayer can either be valid or invalid based on one thing. What is that one thing? If I've sat my second cycle, right? Why my second cycle? Because the sitting in the second cycle in a 4-cycle prayer is wajib, right? What does that mean? It means that if I miss it, so I pray the first, I go down, I come up for the second, I go down, and I should have sat, then I should have rose for the third. But if I didn't if I didn't sit for the second and I just rose again, so now I'm praying the third, what do we say? We say carry on praying. Do the third cycle, do the 4th cycle, then do the prostration for forgetfulness, give your salams, and you're done. You've made up for the deficiency. Why is that? Because the sitting in the second cycle in a 4-cycle prayer is wajib, right? So it's wajib, so you can make up for that deficiency. If, however, you've forgotten and you've not done that, right, and you've basically completed 4 cycles, but you didn't sit for the second cycle, then there's no prayer for you, because you should have prayed a 2-cycle prayer and you didn't, right? So there's no prayer for you. You need to make your prayer up again. In this instance, where you did the sajda sahwu, you did the prostration of forgetfulness, you made up for the deficiency, right? You made up for the problem that you created, hence your prayer is accepted, whereas it won't be in the other instance. Basically a case of where you prostrated, you did your salams late, right? And then the other cycles become like a voluntary prayer for you, and you just ended up doing your prostrations late, you didn't sit, then you do the makeup, the prostration for makeup, and then you do your salams, and then it's you're done. You did your salams late, I wanted to say. So aside from these 4 units for the prayer, he may not shorten any other prayer. So this means that your Maghrib prayer, your Sunnah Mu'akkada, your confirmed and non-confirmed Sunnahs, you may not shorten those. You pray those in full. If he is at a halt on a journey while in a state of rest or relaxation, he should pray his Sunnah prayers as well as the Fard ones. Otherwise, he may leave the Sunnah prayers and just pray the Fard ones. So for example, we've got George here. George is on the old route, the old Arabian caravan route from Mecca to Busra. He ends up stopping in Taif. Taif isn't his final destination. He's still a third of a way less from his final destination. He stops there for 2 days. He's technically considered a traveler because we forgot to mention you're a traveler. He's technically considered a traveler even if he stopped, because he's not arrived at his final destination. His travel is less than the 15. He's stopping for less than 15 days. We'll mention this in a while. So he's considered a traveler, and while he is a traveler, even though he stopped there for 2 days at the oasis, he will pray prayers in their 2 cycles, right? The 4 cycle prayers, he will pray all of them in their 2 cycles. The Fajr by default is 2, Maghrib stays 3 cycles. However, when he prays, he will pray his nawafila, he will pray his sunnahs, he will pray them properly. If he doesn't pray them, there's no worldly consequence on him. But if he's resting for 2 days, then why would he not pray? It's beneficial to pray. As we mentioned, when it comes to ruqsa, when it comes to dispensations, to not do them is more praiseworthy than to do them, right? But you have the option of not doing them also. So he would pray his others if he chooses to, and if he doesn't choose to. But if he stops somewhere and that's not his final destination, then he still prays his prayers in half. Once he reaches a city or village and intends on staying there for at least 15 days, he must fully pray the 4-unit fard prayers rather than shortening, and must fast in Ramadan. Otherwise, if he is still on a journey or is not staying in a city or village, or is but for less than 15 days, then he must still shorten those prayers and may still choose not to fast in Ramadan. Okay, so now this takes a bit of concentration now. We've got George here. So George is traveling. George is in, for example, George is in Manchester and George wants to travel down to London, right? George knows he's only going to be away for 2 days, right? So in this case, when he leaves Manchester, he comes down to London. He's considered a traveller the minute he leaves his city limits, travels all the way down to London, stays in London for 2 days, he's considered a traveller. He shortens his prayer, he doesn't need to fast, he doesn't need, if Eid happens, he doesn't need to go to the mosque to pray Eid. If Friday comes, he doesn't need to go to, it's not wajib upon him, even though he can go, he doesn't need to sacrifice. And then he goes back. He enters his city limits. The minute he enters his city limits, all the obligations fall back on him again. Right, but now that same George now decides that he wants to visit someone. Say George now is in Amman in Jordan, and he wants to go to Damascus, which is around 120 miles away, right? So now George wants to visit his family and wants to stay there for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, that's 21 days, okay? So now George knows that he's going to stay there for 3 weeks. So the minute George leaves his city limits, right, the dispensations start for him. It becomes mandatory for him to shorten his prayer. When he gets to Damascus, the minute he gets there, he is no longer considered a traveler. Once he enters the city of Damascus, even before he gets to the house, he's no longer considered a traveler. Why? Because he's staying now for 15 days, more than 15 days. The minimum period is 15 days. Anything less than 15 days and you're considered a traveler. Anything more than 15 days and you're no longer considered a traveler. So if he stays there for 16 days, 17 days, 18 days, he's no longer considered a traveler. So the obligations, the minute he arrives at his destination, all the obligations fall upon him again. The dispensations were only for his journey. Whether it took 2 hours in the aeroplane, by bus it takes a few hours from Amman to Damascus. That period is his dispensation period only, and he can shorten his prayers in there, and all the other dispensations fall upon him. Now this also applies. For example, we've got George. Now George visits London. George is from, say, Amman. George lives in Amman. George is now visiting London. From Jordan, he flies to London and he stays in London for an English course for, say, 4 months. He does the course. Now, he's here for 4 months, right? So when did we say that the dispensations can start and finish? The dispensations start the minute he leaves his hometown until the minute he arrives to London. Now, if he happened to do that on camel and by ship and it took him 4 months to get there, then he's considered a traveler for 4 months. If he does that by air, he'll be here in about 5 hours, right? So he's considered a traveler for 5 hours. The minute he gets to his place of residence, that is now, that's considered his home. It's considered Watan al-Iqama, right? That's his temporary abode of residence for longer than 15 days, but not eternal, right? So he now is going to be there for the next 4 months. So the obligations fall upon him the minute he's in the city, and he has to pray fully, he has to fast, sacrifice, and everything else we mentioned. Right, now here's the interesting part. Now if George completes his education, now he's going to go back to Amman. Now he's got some free time. He's got free time for, say, a week. Now he wants to sightsee. So he sightsees within his city. Okay, that's fine. He's in his hometown. For 1 week, he's sightseeing in his city, and then he decides to go to Glasgow or Edinburgh or Manchester and see the rest of the Lake District and see the rest of the country. So he leaves. Now, if he wanted to be there for 3 weeks, he wanted to book out a cottage in the Lake District for 3 weeks. Again, it's past 15 days. So again, once he gets there, the minute he's considered a traveler. When he leaves, when he gets there, he's no longer considered a traveler, right? But if he knew in his mind, I'm only going to be here for 2 days, then I'm going to go to Glasgow for a day, then I'm going to go visit Edinburgh, the sites in Edinburgh for a day, then I'm going to travel back to Manchester and visit a friend. He is considered a traveler, and then he keeps shortening his prayers because he's traveling. He's not staying in one place for more than 15 days, right? But now he has got a flight to catch. The flight he's got to catch is from London, and he's run out of money, so he's got to get back to London early now because he can't carry on sightseeing. So he goes back to his residence, which is still under his name for a while, and now he's waiting 2 days for his flight back to Amman in Jordan. What does he do? Right? Now, remember we said he lived there for 4 months. He was living in England. England became his watan al-iqama for a while, right? And that became his home, his temporary abode of existence. He stayed there for 4 months. So he's going back home basically, right? And he's going to wait out in his own room, in his own bed for 2 days, and then he's going to go back. But in this case, he's no longer considered someone who lives there now. He left that place. He left that place and went to a new place. Even though that was his home for 4 months, he left it. He went on to a new place. Now if he comes back and waits for another 2 days for the airplane to take him back to Amman, he's considered a traveler. So he's going to shorten his prayers there as well, right? He's going to shorten his prayers there as well, and then he's going to catch his flight and go back. And the minute he gets to his own place is known as Watan al-Asli. That is his real home. It's always been his real home. And then the minute he gets there, then he no longer has the dispensations. They're all lifted off him, and he has to perform his prayers in full. Fasting, the sacrifice, and everything else is full. The journey of a traveler ends upon entering city limits of his normal place of residence. So Watan al-Asli, your abode, your original abode, is what? It's your permanent abode. It's where you were born. It's where you've lived your whole life. It's where you have a wife, right? So if somebody's got 3 wives, for example, 1 wife in Damascus, 1 wife in Amman, and the 3rd wife in Jeddah, right? And you obviously pay nafaka, you pay for the upkeep of your wives. So where they're living is actually your place, right? So when you visit your wives, it's considered your place. So if you spend 2 days here, 2 days, then obviously you're in Jeddah, then you take a bus ride up to Amman, then you take a bus ride up to Damascus, and then you get a flight back. And he does this 3 or 4 times a year, for example. In this instance, each of those abodes he goes to are considered his abodes, right? He's Watan al-Asli. So there's no dispensations for him. It's not mandatory for him to shorten his prayer. He has to pray his prayer properly. Or if George has taken up a new residence. So a real world example of this would be an expat worker who moves to another country. So George decides he wants a job in Saudi Arabia. So George gets a job in Saudi Arabia. He leaves his house in England, and he's there in Saudi Arabia now for a year, right? That has become his abode now, not England, right? So the minute he gets there, he knows he's there for a year, and he doesn't shorten his prayer. If he decides from there to go to Amman to go sightseeing by bus and then come back, right? The minute he gets back, he's back at his own place. So there's no prayer shortening anymore, right? That's considered his abode where he's living now. And a few other interesting cases come to mind. Example, you've got somebody who doesn't know how long he's going to be in a specific area. So this case actually happened to people I knew, waiting for a visa, right? So for example, if you work in the Gulf, you have to periodically travel out to get a visa extension and come back in again. So colleagues of mine, went to Cairo, they were sent to Cairo, and they were told to wait. And normally the visa process takes a day or two, but in this instance it took a month, right? And I remember we said 15 days, and then you're considered a resident. Now these poor guys, they didn't know. They couldn't tour the country, they couldn't do anything because they were told today, tomorrow, you'll get it tomorrow, you'll get it tomorrow. And they wasted 30 days there doing nothing because they couldn't leave Cairo because they were told, be ready for the embassy, they'll call you anytime. And obviously they were waiting and they kept on being told, tomorrow you'll leave, tomorrow you'll leave. So they never had the intention in their mind that we're here for a month, right? They didn't know this. Now technically that could carry on for years, right? And they're still considered a traveller. Another case is if you're, for example, you're chasing a criminal. For example, a police. This is what I learned of one of my teachers. You're a police officer, you're a constable, private investigator, and you're chasing someone across the world, right? And you're never in one place for more than 15 days. You keep moving 2 days, and you follow him on, you follow him on, you follow him on. If, however, you knew prior intelligence, the next place I go to, he's going to be there for a month, right? Then the minute you got there, then you would shorten your prayers. But if you didn't know this, and you were like, okay, I don't know how long he's going to be here, he's going to do some shady dealing, he's going to carry on, you're just following him across the world, right? Not knowing how long he's going to stay in a particular area. In this instance, you would carry on shortening your prayer, even if it would take years, right? And this would happen if you're there are scenarios where this would happen. Most people aren't in these kind of jobs, but there are people, diplomats and expat workers that have to work. For example, people that work on oil rigs or far-flung areas where they have to go training, and they have like a timetable that's given to them for a month, and it's subject to change very quickly. Doctors, specialist doctors, especially in a war zone where they're traveling from one area to the other area to another area, sometimes it's like hundreds of miles apart. They don't know how long they're going to stay in that area. It happens, and in this instance they'd constantly be considered a traveller. Okay, then the author says, if a traveller prays behind a resident imam without the prayer time, i.e. not qadha, his prayer is valid and he should pray the full 4 units for Dhuhr, Asr or Isha. So for example, George is a traveller. George arrives in Istanbul and he goes to the mosque. Even though he's a traveller, he's going to be there for only 5 days. If he ends up in a mosque and then he decides to pray behind the imam, whatever the prayer of the imam is becomes his prayer, right? If the imam prays 4, then he prays 4. Even though he's a traveller, on his own he'd pray 2, but in this instance he would pray 4 behind the imam. Now, after the prayer time is expired, qadha, however, the traveller may not pray behind a resident, since his prayer, the traveller's, would be invalid. Okay, so what Imam Shanabululi means here is that the prayer of a resident is not as strong as the prayer of a traveller. Because remember we said the original core of the prayer was 2 cycles, right? Now a normal person, a traveller will pray 2 and a resident's going to pray 4. Now the resident, the first sitting for him is a wajib, right? It's a wajib for him, the first sitting. Whereas for the traveller, he only prays 2 cycles, so his first sitting is obligatory. He needs to sit, right? So his prayer is considered stronger, right, than the resident's prayer. So that's why the reverse can't happen. That's the reason why you can't pray. The only prayer you can pray is the prayer that you're praying at its right time. No other prayer you can do this for, right? So if it's a qadha prayer or if it's something else, you can't do it. It's only done for the prayer. For example, if it's dhuhr, dhuhr. If it's asr, it's asr. Now the reverse is true. The reverse is true. Why? Because again, the prayer of the traveller is stronger than the prayer of the resident, and we'll have a look at this now. So in the opposite scenario, a resident praying behind a traveller, the prayer of the resident would be valid regardless of whether they pray in the prayer time or after the time has expired, with the condition, however, that the resident does not complete the 4 units with his imam. The traveller, for if he does, then his prayer is invalid. Okay, so what's happening here is that, for example, let's say that I'm a traveller and my friend is a resident. I stay around his house, he misses Fajr, I miss Fajr, right? So now we're talking about qadha. Can I pray behind him? No. Can he pray behind me? Yes. He prays behind me, and because my prayer is stronger than his, he prays behind me, and then that can happen. The other way around, it can't happen. Now, what if I was a traveler and I have to pray too, and I end up in a place where they make me the imam, and then the congregation decides to follow me. In this instance, I would tell everybody, or even if it's my friend, I would tell him, by the way, I'm a traveler, so I'm only going to pray the two. You now have to complete the rest. So you have to stand up and complete. What they do is I pray the two. Once I finish, I pray the two, I give my salams. They stand up for the third and the fourth. Now, they don't say anything, right? Because they were supposed to pray behind the imam, right? And now they're praying a 4-cycle prayer. The first 2 cycles, I've already prayed. I've given my salams. They prayed behind me. Now remember, there's no recitation behind the imam. So I've finished my prayer. I've given my salams. They're standing up for their 3rd and 4th cycle, right? If I was leading the 3rd and 4th cycle, there would be no recitation, loud recitation. I would do it quietly. In their case, because the recitation should have been done by the imam, right? They're doing it to make up what I gave the salam, so they have to make up the 3rd and 4th cycle. So they do this cycle by saying nothing. They just stand momentarily, and then they go into the bowing, and they go into the prostration, and then they stand up again, then they go into the bowing, and then they go into the prostration, and then they read and say their salams. And also, they don't do the prostration for forgetfulness. So if they make a mistake in their prayer, they wouldn't do the prostration of forgetfulness either. They would just finish their prayer, give their salams, and come out. A missed 4-unit prayer of a traveler is made up as 2 units, even if he is no longer a traveler when he makes it up. So, for example, here, we look at the end of the time, right? The Imam says, likewise, a missed 4-unit prayer of a resident is made up as 4 units, even if he is on a journey when making up. We look at the end of the prayer times. So, what the Imam mentions here is that George is traveling. George missed a prayer, right, during his travels. So when he gets back to his abode, when he has to make up that prayer, he doesn't make it up as a 4-cycle just because he's at home. He makes it up as a 2-cycle. Even if he made it up the next day, right? He makes it up as a 2-cycle because he missed it as a 2-cycle. It was obligatory for him at that point to do a 2-cycle, and he missed it, so he makes it up. And the converse is true as well. So if he misses a prayer where he is based, and then he decides to travel, and then all of a sudden everything else has become, the dispensations start, and it becomes wajib for him to shorten the prayer. If he decides to make that prayer up at some point, he'd make it up as a 4-cycle, because when that prayer was obligated upon him, it was a 4-cycle, right? The end of the prayer time is what is considered. Now what that means is that he had the option of waiting till the end of the prayer time. You can pray, for example, Dhuhr starts at 1 o'clock and it goes on to, depending on where you are, 7 o'clock, let's say, right? If he missed that prayer, right, we look at the ending. Where was he at the end of that prayer time? He was a resident, right? So he had up till that time. So we look at the end. At that time, he was still a resident. So even if he's traveling now, you pray as a resident. The legal ruling regarding the shortening of the prayer and permissibility of not fasting while traveling applies equally to one on a permissible journey and one on an impermissible journey. So it doesn't matter whether you're going for a good deed or a bad deed, whether a thief is going out to steal in another city, or whether you're going out to an Islamic conference, right? The ruling applies regardless. It becomes overarching upon everybody. Okay, so that was the end of today's lesson. So it takes a bit of thinking about. Again, as mentioned, we need to think a bit about this, and it's good to review the lesson again a few times to try to understand the argument of traveling. And no doubt traveling is something that everybody does, and these things will come up again and again in your life, and they do become like second nature. Once you've mastered them, once you've understood them, they become like second nature for you. And then you won't worry about, okay, do I make it up, do I not make it up? Am I supposed to, can I pray behind someone? Can someone pray behind me? Or can I pray qada behind someone? These things will become second nature to you. Don't worry about that. Thank you very much. Wa sallallahu Sayyidina Muhammad. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.